The facts about sex offender management. This is the first of a multi-part series discussing issues relating to sex offender management in our communities. This series is being produced by the Florida Action Committee, a nonprofit organization seeking to educate the public, our legislators, and the media on topics relating to sex offender management with the objective to make our communities safer. The first part of our series will discuss residency restrictions as a sex offender management tool. In 2005, following the rape and murder of Jessica Lunsford, municipalities started passing residency restrictions restricting where a registered person could live. Starting with Miami Beach, cities would pass restrictive ordinances, displacing registered persons from their communities. One by one, other municipalities began enacting their own ordinances to avoid becoming a dumping ground for registrants. Quickly, it became a race to become the harshest on registrants, and by 2011, there were over 140 municipal ordinances in Florida limiting where a registered person could live. This map of Broward County shows the areas in red where a registered person could presumably live. It does not, however, show the school bus stop restrictions, which further reduce these pockets of availability. According to a 2013 report prepared by researcher Jill Levinson, 97% of the second most populated county in Florida was off limits to sex offenders. This onslaught of residency requirements appears to be based on the following ideas: that strangers are abducting children in order to molest and murder them, that residency restrictions will stop this from happening, and that convicted sex offenders are extremely likely to commit additional sexual crimes. The reality is that these are all false assumptions and are unsupported by empirical evidence. Unfortunately, most of these laws were not well thought out. Shortly after going into effect, it was recognized that these residency restrictions created some unintended consequences. Several studies indicate that stricter laws create homelessness in the sex offender population. Homeless sex offenders are harder to track, and transients are more likely than non-transients to have a history of failing to register. Housing instability is a risk factor for recidivism. It disrupts an individual's stability and contributes to psychosocial stressors which can increase risk. Desperate people can do desperate things. Residency restrictions force offenders to live farther away from employment opportunities, treatment services, and public transportation, also creating barriers to reentry. Sex offenders are often not able to live with or near their supportive relatives and friends, thereby impairing adjustment and successful reentry into society. Offenders who are isolated and without a support system are more likely to recidivate. Sex offenders are often separated from their wives and children because of residency restrictions. Sex offenders are clustering in pockets of availability and forming homeless encampments. Residency restrictions give the public a false sense of security, believing that by living in a restricted zone, their children are safer, when in fact 97% of offenses are committed by someone not on the registry. There are three more realities of residency restrictions that need serious consideration. They don't control where a registered person can go during the day. They only take into account where one sleeps at night, generally between the hours of 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. when schools and parks are closed and when most kids are at home sleeping. Registered persons, especially those who are homeless, usually spend days with their friends and families within excluded areas, but have to return to their registered home at night. Also, anyone who is intent on harming a child will not be deterred by a municipal ordinance or having to drive a bit to do harm. The other reality of residency restrictions is that they have been proven repeatedly to be ineffective and even counterproductive. So what have these restrictions accomplished? With limited housing options, offenders who are returned to the community often become homeless. From 2006 until April 2010, over 100 registered persons were living in a makeshift tent city under the Julia Tuttle Causeway in Miami. After being evicted from their homes under the Julia Tuttle Bridge, many registrants moved to the corner of Northeast 79th Street and 10th Avenue near the Shorecrest neighborhood, which is one of the few remaining pockets where a registered person could reside. In 2012, Shorecrest installed 2 spring toys in a vacant lot and christened the Little River Pocket Park, effectively evicting the registrants and closing off that area to new registered persons. Pocket parks are becoming the new solution to entirely banish registered persons from an area. Today there are approximately 90 registered persons living alongside the railroad tracks at Northwest 71st Street and 36th Court in Miami, after being evicted from the trailer park in which they lived. With registrants on the list for life in Florida, the number of registrants will increase dramatically year over year. That, combined with the pace at which municipalities have passed residency ordinances, whatever available housing options that are left are quickly evaporating, and this problem will become much worse over time. Residency restrictions do more harm than good and are actually decreasing public safety. There's no reason to take our word for it. There are a wealth of scientific studies on the subject which are readily available and all come to the same basic conclusions. These studies have found that recidivist sex offenders do not live closer to schools, parks, or other areas where children congregate than non-recidivists. That most offenses occur among acquaintances or family members and not as a result of stranger abduction. That there is no correlation between residency restrictions and public safety. That sex offenders preying on children in schools or parks are very rare occurrences. Despite the fact that residency restrictions are well-intentioned and popular, they actually decrease public safety and distract police and probation officials from actual criminal activity. And residency restrictions actively interfere with social support systems and the stability necessary to prevent registered persons from reoffending. That residency restrictions cause registered persons to go underground and or become homeless, and they separate registrants from employment and social services that are necessary to help them reintegrate and be productive members of society. A Minnesota Department of Corrections study found that not one of the 244 reoffenses between 1990 and 2002 would have been prevented by residency restrictions. So with so much evidence that residency restrictions do not work, why do they continue to be passed? One reason is that it makes politicians look like they are being tough on crime. Not many people have sympathy for sex offenders, so anything that can be done to punish them further will be supported. Another reason is the "not in my backyard" argument. Even though the restrictions are ineffective, nobody wants a higher concentration of sex offenders in their neighborhood, if for nothing more than it brings down the property values. So when one city passes an ordinance, all the neighboring cities need to pass one that is as or more restrictive. Third, the laws were originally based on good intentions and mistaken facts. The legislative intent and preamble to most of these ordinances say that sex offenders have a high rate of recidivism and the laws promote public safety. We now know that sex offenders actually have a very low rate of recidivism, and these ordinances do nothing to promote public safety. Perhaps the most compelling illustration of these points is the Jacob Wetterling Resource Center's position on residency restrictions. They are against them. The abduction of Jacob Wetterling in 1989 prompted the passage of the Jacob Wetterling Act in 1994, which established the National Sex Offender Registry. The Jacob Wetterling Resource Center's website sets forth their position on residency restrictions and states, "Because residency restrictions have been shown to be ineffective at preventing harm to children, and may actually increase the risks to kids, the Jacob Wetterling Resource Center does not support residency restriction laws. Such laws can give a false sense of security while sapping resources that could produce better results used elsewhere." If those who originally advocated for and established the registry recognize that residency restrictions are ineffective and counterproductive, isn't it time we started paying attention?